Hello and welcome to the video lecture for POLS 1 for this week. We have two parts today. The first is on public opinion and the second is on the media. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Welcome back to the first part of the weekly video lecture. The first part will focus on public opinion. And really there are three central topics. How do we know what public opinion is? What are the origins of public opinion and how does it manifest in our politics and policy? And then finally, how can public opinion be measured accurately? So let's go ahead and take a closer look. So first of all, the United States is a democratic republic, and governments that are democratic typically come from a foundation of popular sovereignty, which is a term we focused on way back at the beginning of the semester when we were talking about some of the goals in the US Constitution. Essentially, popular sovereignty means that the government is going to reflect the will of the people. So, democratic governments should reflect the will of the people. They should be based on what people want. So, when we say will of the people, really that means public opinion. What does the public want? What are they hoping that government will do? So how do we know what that will is? I mean, how do we, other than through elections, how do we know what people want between each election? And there are actually ways to do that. So first of all, let's kind of take a closer look here at the term public opinion. And first of all, public opinion comes from knowledge. People tend to assume that they have some basic knowledge about different things if they're serving up their opinion on that topic. Average citizens don't always have vast information about issues or elections in politics, but oftentimes they'll still form those opinions about those specific issues or about elections. Typically, people will say that they like a certain politician just by how they see them on TV or how they, hear them present themselves when they talk. So what are some factors that influence public opinion if we're not just looking at knowledge, right? If there's an absence of relevant information, how are people forming that public opinion? Now, most political scientists say that more political knowledge is going to lead to a more informed public opinion, which they would say is a good thing. So let's take a look at political knowledge here. Now, research shows that most Americans have limited working knowledge of political institutions, processes, and leaders. And what's interesting is that the farther we get away from home, so if you were to take a survey on that's asking you, how do you feel about the job that Congress is doing back in Washington, D.C.? Chances are you would have somewhat of an idea of what's happening on average. However, if we come closer to home, and if I were to give you the same type of survey that asked you what was happening in city government or county government, you would actually have less likely of a chance of being able to present some information, because polls show that people tend to really know next to nothing about local government, even though that's the government that affects them most often. So that would seem to indicate that Americans are not informed, but actually they are informed. Based on political science studies, people do tend to have information. They just can't retain that info to form really deep political opinions about certain topics, candidates, issues. Because being informed politically requires time and energy. And what ends up happening is that if you don't have time and you don't have energy, usually people will rely on shortcuts and cues. Okay, what that means is they will look to trusted sources of information and just go off of what those sources are saying. And those sources can include trusted party elites, meaning prominent politicians who are on TV a lot, or people who are just kind of knowledgeable talking heads, maybe former politicians, journalists, interest groups, media, family, friends, social media, similar sources to that as well. Okay. Because many people just skim and scan the news. In the journalism industry, if a person reads a story for at least 30 seconds, that's actually pretty good. And 30 seconds is not very long. So what that indicates to us is that people don't really spend a whole lot of time digging into political issues or news issues. Now let's define public opinion. So public opinion is made up of values, ideas, and attitudes that people have about issues, events, and personalities. And we can break that down into those three specific kind of subcategories. What are values, also known as beliefs? These are basic principles that shape people's opinions about issues and events. Okay, when I say basic principles, I mean kind of broad, generic concepts about things, which we'll take a closer look at in a little bit. Political ideology, a cohesive set of beliefs that form a general philosophy about government. Typically, this is where we're getting a little bit more well-formed to the point where we can give it a label. You are liberal, you are conservative. Okay, what that means is that you kind of have a set of beliefs that tend to go together to form an approach to how you feel about politics. And then attitude or opinion is a specific view about a particular issue, personality, or event. So if you were to take a poll about people running for president, your attitude would be your specific view about those candidates. Okay, so moving on. I talked about the difference between beliefs and values and ideology and attitude. And I mentioned that values are basic principles that shape opinions about issues and events. Okay, now if we were to ask Americans about a variety of different things, and we started off more broad with basic principles, here's the interesting thing. They tend to agree overwhelmingly. Okay, national elections should be open and fair. That's kind of a little bit kind of getting more into specific values, I guess, because we're talking about elections, but the idea that national elections are open and fair is a pretty core fundamental principle of democracy. So we can put that in the values column. Okay, but as you see, if we start getting more and more specific to the point where we're getting into attitudes, when we start getting into attitudes, for instance, news organizations are free to criticize political leaders. Okay, that's starting to get into an attitude, how you feel about the media. Okay, as you can see, we're starting to get less consensus. Although, because that's still a fairly broad sentiment, there's still a majority of people who agree with that. So the takeaway here is that when we get into values, Americans actually tend to agree on many core democratic values that form the basis of our government. So to kind of reiterate, although there is public agreement over broad values and principles, practical interpretations of principles can result in different attitudes. So if I start serving up specific issues and how we should approach those issues, how we should actually act on something, that's when people really start to disagree and they diverge. Okay, so for instance, let's look at the principle of equality of opportunity. Right? If you were to ask people, if you were to ask Americans, do you believe that all Americans should have equal opportunity under the law? Most people overwhelmingly are going to say, yes, I believe in that. However, now if we start looking at how to apply that principle, let's say we come up with a program called affirmative action, which we looked at in the last lecture on civil rights. Right? Proponents of affirmative action say this is necessary. This is basically a really core civil rights program. But opponents of affirmative action, and there are many, don't see it that way. And so this is actually a pretty controversial issue, and it has been since the 1970s. So that's an example in which where we get into the question over how to implement and protect values when we start getting into more disagreement in public opinion. Let's take a look at political ideology. This is the set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs. And the two prominent political ideologies in the United States today would be liberalism and conservatism. Right? Now, here's the thing. I want to make sure you understand that liberalism and conservatism are political ideologies. Those are not political parties. Ideology is usually associated with specific political parties. For instance, liberals usually tend to be Democrats, conservatives usually tend to be Republicans. But when we start talking about political parties, you'll see that sometimes they're not always super closely linked. Let's take a closer look at each of the two major political ideologies in American politics. First of all, liberalism. Liberals are people who generally support government intervention in the economy, more economic equality, expansion of federal social services, and they tend to have greater concern for consumers and the environment. Looking closer at how liberals feel on different political issues, they tend to support government involvement in the economy to protect workers and expand social services. They advocate for the poor, minorities, women, consumers, and the environment. They tend to support the separation of church and state. And when it comes to foreign affairs, they tend to oppose sending American troops to influence domestic affairs in other countries, and they tend to support international organizations like the United Nations. Taking a closer look at conservatives, they tend to support the social and economic status quo. They are typically suspicious of efforts to introduce new political formulas and economic arrangements, and they tend to believe that a large and powerful government poses a threat to citizens' freedoms. And taking a closer look at conservatives on the issues, when it comes to domestic issues, they oppose generally social and economic engineering, such as wealth redistribution and affirmative action. They tend to seek fewer rules and regulations when it comes to business and industry. They tend to favor lower taxes for higher wage earners. They tend to favor traditional family structures and school prayer. And when it comes to foreign affairs, they tend to support a stronger military power and spending. Although, what's interesting is recently, conservatives who tend to side with candidates like President Donald Trump have supported a smaller military footprint overseas. So that's kind of been a recent bit of a split within conservatives. Uh, Conservatives do tend to be less supportive of international organizations like the United Nations. The way that Americans have approached political ideology has changed. If you look at this graph here, people have slightly become more liberal in the last couple of decades, slightly less conservative, and there's been a kind of a flattening. There's a general decrease and then a flattening of folks who tend to be more moderate. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop here and I'm going to continue talking about public opinion in the next video. So this is the end of the first part of the lecture on public opinion, and I will continue in a second video talking about political socialization.